Breaking news today: the Russian strategy may be superior to our expectations. Some have hoped that Russia's heavy casualties and economic losses in the Ukraine war would make the country reconsider its involvement in the conflict, but this seems unlikely. Russia still stands to gain a lot by pressing on. Russia may be able to afford the costs of the war for longer than Ukraine can. Upwards of 50,000 Russian servicemen have been killed or wounded in Ukraine, and the country stands to lose an untold amount of money due to sanctions, direct costs, and lost productivity as a result of the conflict. Many in the West have hoped that Russia's invasion will prove to be a costly mistake from which it will be forced to withdraw because it failed to take over the entirety of Ukraine at the outset of the conflict. That is where they go wrong. Russia has the capability and will to keep fighting. It appears that Ukraine's highly anticipated spring offensive has stalled, though this is far from certain. If the next few weeks produce the same outcomes, the war may reach a stalemate. Russia shouldn't waste its time and resources fighting a war that neither side can win. To do so, we need to consider Russia's grand strategy as a whole. To discern what long-term objectives Russian President Vladimir Putin might have in Ukraine, we need to begin in 2014. Then, after a string of confrontations between demonstrators and government forces, Viktor Yanukovych was forced from office in Ukraine. The uprising on the Maidan Square gained widespread attention. Knowing why Russia saw Maidan as a threat helps shed light on Russia's ultimate goals in its subsequent dealings with Ukraine. The threat that Maidan would lead to Ukraine's eventual accession to NATO was the initial source of concern for Russia. While EU membership, not NATO membership, was the primary objective of the protesters, Russia saw this as a dangerous precedent. Whether the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or the Federation was in power, Moscow has always viewed threats emanating from modern Ukraine, and especially from the region east of the Dnieper River, as intolerable. At nearly any cost, it will work to drive out the enemy. For Moscow, the idea of NATO troops stationed east of the Dnieper, and especially in Crimea, is inconceivable. As a result, Moscow views NATO expansion as an existential threat. Second, Russia has an interest in Crimea because there are no suitable locations for year-round naval ports on the Russian coast of the Black Sea. Therefore, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is dependent on the port of Sevastopol in Crimea. Russia's continued dominance in the Black Sea depends on the peninsula of Crimea being used by the Navy. Crimea is the only strategic asset for Moscow in Ukraine, as opposed to a liability, like the deterrence of potential threats. However, Russia's post-annexation experience in Crimea suggests that control of the territory directly opposite Crimea on the Ukrainian mainland is crucial to support of Crimea itself, especially in light of Ukraine's economic siege of the peninsula and cutting of its water supply. Last but not least, Russia has tried to prevent the shame that would come from a complete defeat of the pro-Russian rebels in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Russia needs to keep its prestige high in the post-Soviet sphere for strategic reasons as well as for domestic pride. Russia has sway because it is seen as a defender of Russians and other pro-Russian ethnic groups like the Ossetians and Abkhazians in Georgia. Russia's continued influence in the region would be severely hampered if it were seen as weak and ineffective in this role. These three objectives give Russia good reason to stubbornly maintain its current position despite its heavy physical and reputational losses in the Ukraine war. Russia's expansion into a much larger portion of Donetsk and nearly all of Luhansk demonstrates effective support of the rebels, and maintaining the land bridge between Crimea and the Donbass addresses Crimea's strategic vulnerabilities after 2014. The port of Sevastopol and Russia's reputation as protector are two of its most valuable assets in the region, and they are likely to remain so as long as current trends continue. If the front lines do not shift significantly, Russia will suffer because large parts of territory east of the Dnieper will remain in Ukrainian hands. Russian efforts to wreck Ukraine as a functioning state have been effective, as noted by international relations expert John Mearsheimer. Ukraine is much smaller, older, and poorer than Russia, and its population is more volatile due to falling birth rates and increased emigration. The loss of young men in the war and the displacement of young women and children have made these issues much worse. Ukraine's infrastructure has also been deliberately destroyed. Ukraine, like many other countries facing a similar demographic crisis, needs to move quickly to develop its economy and make the most of its available resources. Instead, the war has severely damaged Ukraine's economy, making each passing month a critical month in which Ukraine fails to get on the road to recovery and the likelihood of refugees returning decreases. Simply by maintaining the status quo, Russia is keeping its word to its allies, ensuring the continued existence of its outpost in Crimea, and further weakening Ukraine to the point where it can no longer serve as a functional, prosperous base for NATO assets. In the meantime, sanctions have not had nearly the desired effect on Russia's economy, and the country's already sizable population, now swelled by millions of refugees from Ukraine, means that demographic effects of the war on Russia are likely to be negligible.